So it's been a terrible year for the Seattle Seahawks. There's nothing really to say that that would make it seem like that's not the case. The Seattle Seahawks, from a coaching standpoint, have been pretty much completely outcoached by every single team that they have faced in the NFL, and they just in general are not great. They're 25th in terms of their points scored. Their defense is 23rd in passing, 31st in passing, 23rd in running defense. They don't force turnovers. They're 28th in turnovers. They are last in yards allowed. They're basically last in yards on offense. And you look at all the teams that they have beaten. They beat the Colts, who are not in the playoff race at the moment. They beat the Jaguars, who are 2-9. They beat the San Francisco 49ers, who are not in the playoffs at the moment. Every team that they have lost to is a team that's either in the playoffs or at least hunting for it. You see them get shut out in Green Bay. You see them lose to Tennessee at home. You lose, in Minnesota against the Rams, in Pittsburgh, blah, 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 blah. They lose a lot of games to teams that are, are decent, or either on the same level or a little bit better than the Seahawks. I wouldn't say the Pittsburgh Steelers are an incredible team, but they still beat Seattle. I wouldn't say Minnesota is the best team in the world, but they still beat Seattle. At this point, the Seattle Seahawks have a rough offseason coming ahead of them. There is a really good chance that they don't have Russell Wilson anymore after this season. And I would say it's almost a guarantee that Pete Carroll is not the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks after this season. And possibly John Schneider is no longer the GM of the team as well. Now, I don't necessarily think that this is a great idea. Because if you look at what Pete Carroll and John Schneider have done over their about decade-long tenure in Seattle, there is no better franchise stretch of play in Seattle Seahawks history than since John Schneider and Pete Carroll came to the team. Obviously, they have the only Super Bowl win in franchise history. They went to another one the next year, and they've been consistently one of the best teams in the NFL for, like I said, that decade-long stretch since they had, they drafted Russell Wilson in the third round in 2011 or 2012. They've hired Pete Carroll from USC. They hire John Schneider to be the GM. The Seahawks have never been better, and they've gone through stretches where they've looked incredible. They've gone through very little stretches of time where they look like a bad football team. Right now is the only stretch of time where they look like a bad football team. That comes on the heels of having Russell Wilson miss a few games. That comes on the heels of having your defense completely decimated, both personnel-wise and just in general, your team gets trashed by every single member of the media in the NFL. And right now, a lot of things aren't necessarily being said that are fair about the Seattle Seahawks. Now, at the end of the day, the Seattle Seahawks have done a very poor job of drafting players in the past few years under John Schneider and Pete Carroll. That is something I cannot tell you is really, It's not really excusable how poor they have drafted over the past few years. They have a very, very, very long history of trading out of the first round. They have a very, very, very long history of taking players who are probably developmental picks instead of taking guys who are probably the best player at the moment. And they just have a poor history of developing guys that aren't those late round picks. They develop guys like Russell Wilson. They develop guys like Richard Sherman. They develop guys that are, little known prospects throughout the draft. And the guys that they take in the first rounds never pan out to be somebody that can actually do something for their team. You look at names like LJ Collier. You look at names like Jermaine Ifedi. You look at names like that who just are terrible, terrible picks in the moment. And people call them terrible picks in the moment. And the Seattle Seahawks are one of the few teams who every single player that they've taken in the past few years in the first round who gets dubbed a bust, they're one of the few teams who actually are busts at every single one of those picks. Rashad Penny, Christine Michael a few years before that. These are names that send chills up Seattle Seahawks fans' spines because they know how terrible the picks are in the moment. They don't want to say anything because they know that they've developed guys like Russell Wilson or Richard Sherman or Bobby Wagner or KJ Wright or Earl Thomas or Cam Chancellor. These are names who were in the past that were developed well in the Seattle Seahawks organization. But when you bring up names like Christian Michael, you bring up names like Rashad Penny, you bring up names like Jermaine Ifedi, you bring up names like anyone, almost anyone, LJ Collier, Rasheem Green. These are names where the Seattle Seahawks they decided to go in a certain route that worked before, but it isn't working anymore. And for that reason almost alone, I think is what's going to be the nail in the coffin for John Schneider in terms of a GM standpoint. Now, outside of the draft, they don't do a great job in terms of supplementing their team either. They have yet to try to go out and do something for this offensive line. Outside of trading for Dwayne Brown, which that was a terrible trade for the Seattle Seahawks in general, I think they gave up a third-round pick for Dwayne Brown, who was well out of his prime by the time he got let go by the Houston Texans. I think there's one few thing when you look at these expansion teams like the Houston Texans or the Jacksonville Jaguars, or teams that are in their youth, compared to these other franchises, or teams who are just, when a team gives up a franchise player, one of the best players in franchise history like Dwayne Brown was for the Houston Texans, that has to be a red flag. Especially at the moment the Houston Texans were looked at as a competing team in the AFC South. That has to be a red flag for you. Now, with Pete Carroll, and as far as he's concerned, if I'm a Seahawks fan, which I live in somewhat Seattle area, I would consider Pete Carroll one of, if not the best head coaches in Seattle Seahawks history. Like I said, they have the only Super Bowl win in franchise history in 2013 when they beat the Broncos, and they bludgeoned them. But with that being said, I don't know if what Pete Carroll does is necessarily effective anymore in today's NFL. He's a high energy guy. He's a guy who's always going to be up for game day. But I don't know, his defensive philosophies, I don't know if they necessarily mesh well with what their defense actually does well. They don't get after the passer, they don't protect the pass, they don't defend the run, they don't do anything great. And offensively, I think there's always this issue, and I know Pete Carroll, like I said, is basically defensive coordinator as the head coach. But he does have a say in what the offense does. And I think there has always been this thing with Pete Carroll in Seattle, outside of maybe 1 or 2 years where they were playing incredible football on the offensive side of the ball. I think there's always been this, ebb and flow of philosophies not being on the same page between him, between Russell Wilson, and between whoever the offensive coordinator is. And you have to realize Pete Carroll hires these offensive coordinators. He hired Brian Schottenheimer. He hired Shane Waldron from the LA Rams. He's hired guys before. And they're just not great options. And when you compare them to guys who are floating around in the league right now who have been up for hiring positions, like Eric Bieniemy, you hire Eric Bieniemy as this offensive coordinator, this offense takes off. You hire someone like Matt LaFleur, who was up for grabs a few years ago, and they have taken off in Green Bay. You hire somebody who can actually do the job well. And I wouldn't be surprised if they hire someone, a Byron Leftwich from Tampa Bay. If they hired Jason Garrett, that'd be really funny. But, if they hired a young guy like Byron Leftwich, if they hired someone like Kellen Moore in Dallas, if they hired someone who's young, who's not inexperienced, but has experience to gain, I think that would be incredible for the Seattle Seahawks offense. But instead, they go for guys who are established, apparently, in the league who just don't work out. And they have a track record of not working out. So I don't know why it's a surprise when they don't work out. But at the end of the day, it's going to be unfair for Pete Carroll to be fired at the end of the season because of what he has done for this franchise. But this ownership group does have to make a move, and keeping Pete Carroll and John Schneider around for after this season, it's just going to spell the end of the Russell Wilson era, even worse than it's already going to end. Because if they keep those two around, it's almost going to be like we don't need Russell Wilson around anymore. We can do this on our own, which we saw what that looked like with Geno Smith as the quarterback. We saw what that looked like. If you're a Seattle Seahawks fan, you saw what that looked like when you guys signed Matt Flynn to be your guy. When you had Tavares Jackson, Charlie Whitehurst. These are names that were starting quarterbacks for the Seattle Seahawks before Russell Wilson came around. He saved this franchise. They need to do the right thing and let him go, and they need to do the right thing and let Pete Carroll and John Schneider go at the end of this season.